Thank you, everyone. And also, if people are excited to have their videos on, I know it's winter, but you're welcome to bring your pets, your cups, your mugs, your couches, whatever you feel like, wherever you feel like, maybe some sunlight. We'd love to see your faces as well. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really such a privilege to have Sally with us running this session. Her expertise and her work speaks for itself. So we really are super honored to have her, share her time. I know she's super busy, so really grateful for that. But before we do start any event, I do want to recognize and acknowledge that we are all gathered on First Nations land and recognize that sovereignty was never ceded. I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and recognize that land, waters, air have been cared for millennia. And the reason we're able to gather and do advocacy, do storytelling, to empower the communities we come from is because of the traditional owners, the caretaking that they've extended, and the welcome that they extend to all of us migrants on these lands. I'm calling from Darugland, and I'd encourage everyone to drop in the chat where they're coming from. Thank you so much. I'll pass it on to Shannon to give us a lovely introduction of Sally, whose reputation obviously precedes her.
Jump off mute. Thank you so much for that beautiful acknowledgement, Naonika. I'm calling in from Wurundjeri country today. And as Naonika said, Sally doesn't need very much of an introduction, but I will do one anyway. So I'm really pleased that you've joined us all today. I'm really, really happy that Sally has joined us today. As you all know, Sally is one of Australia's leading advocates for refugee access to higher education. I just want to note that the meeting will be recorded and we will be uploading the seminar in the next couple of days if you wanted to share it with colleagues who weren't able to attend today. So as you know, Sally is the founder and CEO of Refugee Education Australia and co-leader of the new, relatively new Refugee Student Settlement Pathway to Australia. It's a groundbreaking program that enables refugee students to migrate safely to Australia on permanent humanitarian visas to pursue university study and build secure and long-term futures here. So we've asked Sally to join us today just to lead a discussion on the recently launched State of Refugee Education in Australia report, which was produced by Mayan and Refugee Education Australia. The report, as many of you might already know, maps successes and gaps across the education continuum and calls for nationally consistent, culturally appropriate measures to support refugee students in Australia. So I thought it would be a good opportunity for those who may not have had the chance to do a deep dive into the report yet to come along and hear a bit more about it. So yeah, this is a very casual sort of presentation and discussion today. So Sally is going to explore the report's key findings and advocacy angles for us, and also share perspectives on how we can strengthen data, policy and practice to ensure equitable access to education for refugee students. So we'll have time for questions about the report and the Student Pathways program as well. Yeah, so feel free to pop your questions in the chat or put your hand up when we have time for questions. Yeah, and just please join me in welcoming Sally.
Well, hi everyone, and thank you so much for the invitation. This was a labour of love. It took a long time, both Refugee Education Australia and the report that I'll talk about, and the Refugee Student Settlement Pathway. I might do a double presentation, actually. I might start with some information about the report and the advocacy agenda, and then I might turn to share a bit of information about the pathway, because it's a great example of what happens when advocacy, a kind of problem, a solution, a policy window, and a bit of policy entrepreneurship comes together to create something new and needed. I'm going to share my screen. So let me tell you first of all about the State of Refugee Education report, and I'll pop a link to the report in the chat as well if you haven't heard me talk about this before. For lots of reasons, it felt like a good time to take the temperature of refugee education. Before I go on, I absolutely should also acknowledge that I'm meeting today on unceded Gadigal land here in Sydney and want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And of course, when we're talking about new arrivals, this issue of welcome and gratitude for the lands on which we all live and which we, unless you are First Nations, we all have a migration history too, is particularly important. And thank you to Nyonika for a beautiful acknowledgement at the beginning. So this report came from the emergence of Refugee Education Australia. You may have heard me banging on about refugee education over the last 10 years, but maybe under a slightly different hat of Refugee Education Special Interest Group. So we were a grassroots organisation for about 9 years, really focused, I think, much more on higher education access, particularly on people seeking asylum scholarships, have long worked with Mayan on this and adjacent issues, have long worked with lovely Asma, who's on the call from Monash, for example, is a really great example of a university that have invested in access for both people seeking asylum and for people with permanent protection. But we fell over with volunteer fatigue about 17 million times, particularly during COVID. And so at the end of 23, we decided that we needed to kind of push forward and find a more sustainable version of ourselves. So hence the birth of Refugee Education Australia. So we're a national charity now. We've got public benevolent institution status, and we have deductible gift recipient status, important factors when starting a charity. Our vision remains the same. So it's really about investment. Advocacy is an interesting question when you're a public benevolent institution because you're not technically allowed to do it, because there's a whole sufficiency of connection argument that the ACNC applies. Instead of talking about advocacy, we talk more about mobilising for change. But ultimately, we're still working towards a goal of an education system that is more inclusive and has fewer gaps. And there's a heap of research out there, and there's loads and loads of, anecdata across the country. But what this report that I'll talk about in a moment that Mayan and Ria collaborated on does is it kind of brings all of the parts of the system together, and it shows all the ways that there are quite significant gaps that impact less on access, but more on transition, definitely on engagement and participation, certainly on achievement and success, and absolutely on transition into meaningful employment. Education, as I'm sure we all agree, is absolutely fundamental to good resettlement. And good resettlement is obviously not a benign, taken for granted term. But we think to get there, there are lots of things that are left to do. Also, just to the side, I'm a recovering academic. I took a redundancy from a university that should not be named last year. And so I do bring that kind of knowledge of the system in. I also am a teacher educator, just in case I need to kind of show my credentials, and have worked. I started my career as a language teacher and have long and always worked with refugee and migrant students as an adult migrant English teacher. I'm also, because my background's more in adult education, of course, I think school is absolutely fundamental, but I often think, and this is, kind of point of divergence from my end, that we also need to think about adults who are arriving in Australia and who also have, needs and desires to re-establish or to establish careers. And so, this pathway to meaningful employment is both the pathway from a period, an engagement with education, whether it's school, whether it's vocational, whether it's higher education. It's often a pathway to being able to develop increased agency and self-determination. But we mustn't lose focus on adults in the mix who are often left out of conversations, and often for first-generation migrants and refugees get stuck in survival work. And we all know the stories of people who were engineers or dentists who end up working for Uber. So just to set that scene, obviously for Mayan's National Policy Alliance, we're much more focused on the youth cohort and context. But some of our work really does kind of look at that skilled employment piece that's beyond, not always, but slightly beyond a youth model. We have 5 public goals. Our number one public goal, which is our absolute central mission for our charity is to support students' agency. And so one of the things that we've long done is host resources. One of the resources is our scholarships table, which hosts information about all the scholarships around the world. We've started to augment that. So last year, Asma, you put your camera on, so I feel like you're happy for me to mention you. Asma and Jude from Monash University did a webinar for us, for example, on how to write a good motivation statement. So we've started to layer in a lot more kind of education and information aside from static information. And this year, I'm really happy to say that we're about to launch in Refugee Week our new RIA Pathfinder, which is an AI-generated study navigator, and we will host a student kind of tertiary focused student hub and studio as well. So watch out for more information about that next month. I will move on quickly, but because I could speak for hours on all of this, as I'm sure you're aware. So with RIA becoming a charity, with a slight bump in the journey to the refugee student settlement pathway, which was a big fat no from a budget request back in May 2024, I've got kind of, I had a little moment of a sad memory 2 years ago when I got a meeting with the Department of Home Affairs the day before budget to say, yeah, no, we're not going to give you any money for the pathway. And so that kind of galvanized a little bit of advocacy or mobilizing for change that led to this report. Happy to say, and I'll talk about the pathway in a moment, that actually that decision did us a massive favor. And now we've got a really excellent refugee student settlement pathway up and running without any investment from the government, which is helpful when you need to make quick, agile decisions. Also last year, you'll be aware that Australia resettled her 1 millionth refugee. So it's a particularly timely moment in Australia's history to kind of take the temperature. When we know that education is absolutely fundamental to resettlement, it's long been established as a key marker and means of integration in models of integration. And yet it is often an under-considered, if not outright ignored component of resettlement from the Department of Home Affairs, who do have shadow departments for every other marker and means of integration, such as health and employment, but don't have one for education. So it was a good time to kind of take the temperature and ask, is Australia doing enough? Now, I really have to add a caveat to say, despite the lack of attention to multicultural affairs and humanitarian migrants, a little bit unskilled, less on humanitarian migrants in this year's budget, it is important to note that Australia has an incredibly generous resettlement programme. We could all agree, I'm sure, that it's flawed in all sorts of ways and could be improved in all sorts of ways. But actually, comparatively, Australia punches well above its weight when it comes to refugee resettlement. We resettle more UNHCR referred people than almost any other country in the world except for Canada. And maybe we're now comparable with Canada because Canada have also cut their intake. The US, who habitually took about 100,000 or thereabouts for many years, has now cut their refugee intake to about 4,000. And those 4,000, and it might check my numbers always because I might be wrong on that number, but I can tell you categorically that the number of refugees who have been taken by the US this year are all white and all Afrikaners. And that is a policy position of the new Trump administration that is deplorable and has massively impacted on resettlement numbers around the globe, and all at the same time when global displacement numbers have hit an all-time high. And that number in the slide there is actually outdated. It's probably closer to 130 million now with the issues in the Middle East. So all of that to say, Australia does have a generous resettlement programme. It does have a slightly underfunded, continues to be slightly underfunded, but a pretty solid public education system. And obviously it's got independent schools in the mix as well, with FAFE and fee-paying schools. But it's our observation, and I think the research really tells us a clear story about this, and I'm sure that you've got similar reflections, that there are all sorts of ways that new arrivals, whether they're refugees or not, are experience substandard educational outcomes. They experience all sorts of microaggressions, they experience gaps in provision, they might not get the resourcing they need, and depending on where they're resettled, so particularly in regional Australia, they may not access the kinds of supports with language that they really need. And that's just the beginning of a long list. So we took the temperature, we looked at the education system from early childhood, primary, high school, AMEP, which kind of sits outside of the education mix because it's actually administered by the Department of Home Affairs, and is seen as more of a settlement program, but obviously is fundamental and is absolutely an education program. We looked at vocational education and we looked at higher education. This was written by a cast of thousands, so researchers with expertise in refugee education and all of those sectors. And across the board, the kind of key finding, which I'm sure won't be a surprise to anyone, is that data is the major problem. We don't have the data that we need. Refugee students or new arrival students, particularly if we think about students who have refugee-like backgrounds but aren't captured by a humanitarian entrant visa, are often invisible, particularly in post-school contexts. The departments of education across the country, because of the federated system, don't talk to each other and they don't share data on this. And some departments will share quite granular data. So New South Wales, it is possible to get a really granular analysis. And I don't know if there's anyone from New South Wales Department of Education on the call, but there's access to data that can be really helpful for thinking about planning. But in other contexts, not so much. So there's real national variation when it comes to school level data, where that data is more regularly available. For post-school tertiary pathways, often this is not an immediate priority and may not happen within the 4 years of someone having a permanent protection visa until they're encouraged to become a citizen. And so we can also lose sight of people in the tertiary sector. And of course, underneath all of this is a kind of self-disclosure issue that lots of people wouldn't necessarily want to be recognised as a refugee. However, there are many characteristics of forced migration, absolutely not true for everyone, and I don't want to take an essentialist view, but there is a kind of view that, you know, there are commonalities in terms of displacement and the impacts of displacement, maybe displacement in several countries, learning across different languages, probably access to limited or no nationally recognised education, maybe engagement with an alternative education system, which can lead to qualification recognition issues or admissions issues. So these are all kind of underplayed if we don't know who we're working with. Similarly, there's limited consistent identification and certainly no tracking across the different sectors of education. This is an issue actually writ large for many cohorts in the Australian education system, particularly post-school, but it can make it incredibly difficult to track outcomes and for us to be able to say confidently how well new arrivals and recent arrivals do in their education. We do have some data from the Building a New Life in Australia longitudinal study, which looked at just under 2,500 humanitarian migrants, both permanent and temporary protection, between 2013 and 2024, over a 10-year period or thereabouts, certainly over 6 data collection points. So we do have a sense of how well people settle, and there are questions about education and employment in the Building a New Life in Australia study, but not at a granular level. So we can't really tell very clear stories. I do have a summary of some analysis of educational trajectories that I'll send via Shannon to everyone. But there are some really stark figures, particularly when it comes to people studying in the adult migrant English program with regard to offboarding from language education and into other tertiary or vocational or higher education opportunities. We don't have a strong sense of higher education participation for school leavers, with the caveat that Associate Professor Tebeje Moller at Deakin University did a Freedom of Information request to the Commonwealth Government for higher education participation data of African refugee youth over a 15-year period. And the standout figure from that study is that 87% of the students who enrolled in a programme of higher education either paused or withdrew, meaning that only 13% actually completed their studies. And we don't know if that was before they passed a census date, and we don't know if that means that they accrued some level of student debt but without any qualification at the end. So that really tells us a compelling story about why we think refugees should be a nationally identified equity cohort to drive greater kind of awareness and data tracking of refugee learners. And basically, I mean, there's a much longer form argument in the report, so please do read the report. But essentially, the argument is that the system is absolutely full of gaps, and some of these gaps have common threads. So information sharing and communication with communities is an area that deserves a bit more attention, particularly for early childhood, and acknowledgement that cultural frames will shift according to issues of care and education. Language is obviously an absolutely fundamental thread that runs through all of the challenges that new arrivals, irrespective of if they have a forced or other migration background, experience. I had a PhD student, who was looking at Indonesian diaspora family language planning, and he with one of his families, he heard that the child of the family, who was a Bahasa speaker, was pulled out of classes to help onboard a newly arrived student in that school in a pretty well-resourced area of Sydney, I might add, to do some language brokering, suggesting that schools are not using, or that school in particular didn't know to use TIS or another interpreting service, and critically impairing in all sorts of ways both children's kind of engagement with education in that moment. Now, of course, I don't want to in any way demonize teachers, because teaching is an incredibly hard job, and it's an incredibly valuable job, and it is a vocation, and it's a profession that is fraught with all sorts of resourcing shortages and challenges, but it is a wonderful job. So I think I think it's important to note that this is not at an individual level, although we do hear also in the literature and through anecdata that there are lots of low expectations set on new arrivals, often because of a misunderstanding about language proficiency and readiness to study, that probably requires a professional development lift. But it is the systems and structures themselves that create challenges. With school, obviously, there's a lot of work at the moment and an investment actually in the budget again this year on anti-racism work in schools, which is welcome. But our authors for the school section, including Dr. Melanie Bart from Adelaide University, includes a recommendation that shouldn't just be seen as a bullying issue, and that it should be seen as a whole of system requirement to consider anti-racism work. At the moment, it's ad hoc, it's variable across the country. The departments don't speak to each other, and there remains inconsistent resourcing. In fact, Melanie's work also pointed to where students do attract funding, for example, additional loading for EALD support, because of the devolved powers in many states to schools to make local decisions. There were examples in her data from an Australian Research Council funded project where principals were using the funding to support other cohorts who were considered more unruly, and there was a kind of perception that the newly arrived refugee kids were pretty easy to manage, like behaviourally, and so the focus wasn't there. Now, I think that also reminds us that schools are incredibly complex organisations and are dealing with all sorts of things, and essentially a teacher is a social worker and is a pseudo parent and might be, all sorts of other things at once. And so it's really important to remember and not lean into a kind of demonising teachers narrative. With the AMEP, which is designed for English language for migrants, there are some challenges either side of a kind of spectrum. One is with pre-literate learners. So this would be more for adults arriving, that pre-literate learners need a slightly different approach. There's concern that people who aren't literate in their first language spend an extended amount of time in the AMEP without achieving the kind of goals that the AMEP sets, which is completely congruent with the time it takes to develop language. It's a very difficult thing to do, to ask someone to learn a new code if they don't have an existing code to hang it on. So some interesting things happening around the country at the moment with things like first language literacy classes before teaching English, or teaching low-level English language alongside a kind of vocation like gardening or cooking, so that there's a kind of a physical kind of quick material relevance to the language that's being taught. But more so, and I think particularly prevalent for this conversation, and with Maya, we've been working on some advocacy around youth programming. We ran a consultation on this with AMEP providers and the youth special interest group, and have come up with some really exciting ideas about how youth programming can be better embedded and better resourced. At the moment, it hangs on a bit of a bums on seats argument for AMEP providers. And, you know, for students who arrive, young people who arrive in their late adolescence, so perhaps in kind of late high school or senior school, there is a prevalent narrative and concern that high schools find them difficult to enrol for all sorts of reasons. And so they might be offboarded from the school system into an adult migrant English class and might be studying alongside their parents, which is, you know, suboptimal for most young people. For vet and higher education, refugees are just not recognised as an equity cohort. They are in terms of there'll be some recognition perhaps with an admission centre, but they're not recognised necessarily in the kind of practical day-to-day post-enrolment period. As I said, there's issues with self-disclosure, and then there's all sorts of navigational barriers in terms of what's the best pathway. Often university is seen as the best pathway, and often new arrived families see medicine or engineering or high value, high status professions as the only option for new arrivals. That makes a lot of sense if you've spent a lot of time in displacement, and a sense of time and worth shifts accordingly. But to get into those kinds of courses, TAFE is often a really great pathway. Also, universities, a lot of universities have fee-free uni-ready programs that can be a kind of try before you buy to see how ready you are. And so, you know, we need a bit more programming around options and information sharing, and that's exactly what the RIA Pathfinder is designed to do. So let me tell you about our call to action. This is the advocacy or mobilising for change ask. Firstly, we think we need a national refugee education framework. I've actually heard recently that a similar programme of work is happening with the refugee health advocacy network as well, so which also experiences all sorts of gaps between, you know, the federated states and territories and other parts of the system. So it'll be interesting to see how government respond. We think a unified national framework will help to coordinate policy and address those issues of inclusion, transition, success, and ultimately data. We think for tertiary education, particularly higher education, there needs to be formal equity recognition, because I can tell you categorically that there's a handful of universities, and happy to say Monash is one of them, but most universities, unless there is a bit of a compliance and risk factor, they're not going to consider this cohort as important enough to dedicate resources to, because they are so small in number relative to the general student cohort. Although we could also make an argument that refugee students experience many of the challenges that international students do, and that universities generally provide very little language support once someone is enrolled. And we need better data. So we're hoping that the unified national framework and the formal equity recognition across the board with some shared definitions, shared parameters, will lead to better data, more granular, more nationally consistent collection of data to help make the educational progression of refugees visible and more trackable. I might stop sharing that screen, and I might open for questions, and then I might share another screen and tell you about the refugee student settlement pathway. Oh, hi, Jal and Sally. Any questions? It's because it was such a comprehensive presentation. I've only done it 11 million times.
Quick question, actually. And I'm just going to say, you know, you just have such rich knowledge on this topic. An hour certainly isn't enough to talk about it all. But yeah, it's such an incredible example of the impact that sustained advocacy can really have, particularly when you're working with no or minimal resources. Like, yeah, it's just, yeah, such a wonderful example of that. But I was just thinking about, since the launch of the report, how has the report been received by maybe people in government who weren't so supportive of the program in the beginning? Yeah, just curious about some of that.
So we launched the report in Sydney back in February, and Julian Hill, Assistant Minister Julian Hill, launched it. He is, along with our patron, Peter Shergold, Professor Peter Shergold. And both of them, I mean, certainly Julian was the best minister in many ways, because he has an assistant ministership in both Home Affairs and Education. Julian started his presentation or his kind of response to the report by saying, well, the department have given me some notes, but I'm just going to put them to the side. And then he spoke really eloquently for 20 minutes about how much he agreed with all the points, and could see and made a comment about how expensive AMEP is and how it does need some reform. So since the request for tender has been terminated, there's a little room for advocacy. So that's a good moment to move. And then Peter made a really compelling speech about how this is really about investment, and it really needs a shift in narrative around investing, particularly when it comes to tertiary study, so that we can really realise first-generation migrants and refugees' aspirations and contributions and potential contributions in ways that Australia traditionally hasn't, because of this lack of kind of joined up thinking. I have since sent a message, and I've met with Minister Clare, so the Education Minister's advisor, on some of these issues, and sent a letter. And I think what's happening with higher education in particular, so the request from to the Minister was to guarantee a Commonwealth supported place to anyone who has a humanitarian visa as a way of incentivising enrolment for people in later years, obviously language proficiency and academic readiness specific. That would absolutely help the refugee student settlement pathway as well, because typically refugees will get captured under low socioeconomic status. So there's really 4 identified equity cohorts that kind of have policy and funding. That's low SES, rural and remote, although that's changed slightly. And so the funding has gone to regional campuses now rather than following the students. First Nations students, obviously, and students with disabilities. So you could make an argument, if you had to, that refugees would fit under low SES and possibly under students with disabilities if they have some trauma or other reasons to kind of get caught under that umbrella. Again, it comes down to issues of self-disclosure, which, I don't think anyone who's experienced forced migration would want to be captured under the term disability, and that's a real challenge at universities that often have that framing, that inclusivity, disability framing for things like special consideration. Our point is, that's not good enough, that the students who have forced migration backgrounds actually have specific needs that won't be met under a big umbrella of low SES. And in some states, and Tasmania would be one of them, the whole state is low SES. So where's the kind of tailoring within? Am I right on saying that, Jal and Sally? I think I am. I'm pretty sure that Tasmania is counted as low SES. And so, there's no nuancing of practice at that level. I also asked, the request was also that refugees be an identified equity cohort. So stop, to kind of move away from that. So guaranteed CSP and equity cohort recognition. I think what's happening with higher education at the moment is everything's being handballed to the newly developed Australian Tertiary Education Commission, the new ATEC. So happy to say on the record on this video that I got an underwhelming response from the Commonwealth Department of Education. I wasn't satisfied, and I will be following up along with another set of asks. I feel like, I had a seat with the Minister's aid, and now I'm going to use it. I'm going to seek to re-sit in that seat many times. Because, the Minister is from Western Sydney and is passionate about all things equity in his rhetoric, and I'd like to see it recognised in policy, because it's not a legislative change, despite what the Department of Education wrote back to me. It's a policy change, and the legislative instrument doesn't need to be changed. So I'd like to see a real sign of commitment from the Minister on this. And, watch this space, but it definitely needs coordinated support, and we could coordinate a letter writing spamming campaign if you felt that was useful, because certainly this is an issue that won't go away. It's been an issue for a long time, and it really does need to be addressed. And it's not a big ask, because it's not additional funding. Refugee students essentially would get captured under low SES students with the Commonwealth supported place guarantee for equity cohorts, but that's not the point. And also, we want CSPs specifically for postgraduate courses for people who've experienced forced migration, because undergraduate with credential creep is often not the end point for many people. And obviously, by the time you get to postgrad, you may well have many, many years of experience between your arrival in Australia and your entry into a postgrad course. But that doesn't mean that equity argument has been resolved. It needs to be acknowledged in policy. So yes, that's very much an active part of what we're doing at the moment. In terms of other responses, I mean, we've spoken at the Settlement Engagement Transition Support Community Practice meetings. Really happy to say that the first round of meetings this year have all been on education. So it's been really wonderful to generate those conversations with colleagues that we might have had to have worked a bit harder to get their attention. So yeah, looking to see where there might be greater connections with settlements, particularly SETS providers, in terms of providing some of that pathway advice and practical responses in lieu of some of these bigger policy revisions that we'd like to see. Yeah, lovely, great. Let's lead a letter writing campaign. I've got a letter. You can all use it. You can write it 100 times. We should send it on the daily until they see that we're a pest that they can't ignore.
Yeah, amazing. Send it through.
I will. Can I really quickly bore everyone? I think it's fascinating, but can I tell you very quickly about the refugee student settlement pathway? Because you might have some questions about this. I'm taking over. So forgive the slide pack. This is a slide pack for a slightly different reason, but it will give you the kind of overview. So the refugee student settlement pathway is now up and running. We had 19 students start with us at the beginning of the year. It's a massive collaboration run by SkillPath, which is led by Steph Cousins, who used to be the CEO of Talent Beyond Boundaries. So she's got a lot of experience in this line of work around complementary pathways, co-designed with the Department of Home Affairs and Community Refugee Sponsorship Australia, and a huge coalition, a growing coalition of Australian universities and a cast of thousands, including, of course, our wonderful friends at Mayan, who helped us by developing a youth advisory group, which was so useful for the setup and the initial development of the RSSP. The RSSP is we want it to be permanent, so it's a new complementary pathway for refugee students. I say complementary pathway in the sense that it's an additional resettlement pathway, but it's not truly complementary because it's using a 202 visa, so it is coming out of the existing quota. Advocacy continues to vehemently petition for complementary pathways such as CRISP and the refugee student settlement pathway to be additional to the quota. This is a youth-based program. It's based on the Canadian program, which has been in existence for nearly 50 years. Students are aged 18 to 30, so they need to be within that threshold when they apply, not when they arrive. We've been working and doing open rounds of recruitment in 3 Asia-Pacific countries, Malaysia, India, Thailand, with a view to absolutely expanding. This year, we have also got a partnership with Duolingo, which means that we've also got students who are displaced in Africa joining the program. In fact, we've got a mid-year entry coming in semester 2, and we've got, I want to say 8, I might have that number slightly wrong, Duolingo students arriving all from India and Uganda, Zimbabwe and Kenya. So students migrate to Australia on a 202. They are met by a student welcome group, so very similar to the CRISP model. This is students and staff at a local campus who work with a facilitator at the university to kind of work out the lay of the land in terms of the services available locally, but also on campus. And they do things like they do the resettlement work similar to a CRISP group in terms of meeting the student at the airport, helping them to set up with Centrelink, bank account, but really more involved in the social kind of orientation to campus and social activities. So far is our experience. They will be helping students to move out of their accommodation when that free accommodation period ends. So because they're coming on a 202, that means they have permanent protection. They have immediate access to a Commonwealth supported place for undergrad. We found out the hard way, not necessarily for postgrad. So that's one of those advocacy asks. Definitely have access to HECS. And obviously have unrestricted work rights and access to either youth allowance or Oz study. Also, depending on whether that course that they want to do is on the Services Australia list. We've learned lots of things in doing this course, in doing this program the first time. I don't need to tell you why we need the pathway, but I can tell you that we've kind of framed this also, it is a skilled pathway. And so we have got some priority study areas that map onto Australia's skills gaps. The process is that a university, well, actually the process is that people apply. We also then source universities. This is my role. So I'm like the Pied Piper of universities, trying to get new universities on board. There are some universities in the mix, including in states where you are based, or even universities that you work at that are not currently involved in the RSSP, and we want to see them on board. I'm pretty sure that Tasmania will be receiving RSSP students, by the way, Sally and Joe. But still working my magic with some of the other universities around the country. But we did have 8 universities start with us at the beginning of this year, from west to east. So we've got Curtin in Western Australia, we've got the ANU in the ACT, we've got UTS, Western Sydney, Uni Sydney in New South Wales, University of Queensland in Queensland, and then in Victoria we have Uni Melbourne and Victoria. But really happy to say that Swinburne University are coming on board for semester 2 this year, so which is great because we want to test dual sector TAFE to uni pathways, really encouraging other dual sectors to get on board. And there's a whole process. I won't tell you about the details, but in terms of roles and responsibilities, SkillPath are the responsible organisation. I work for SkillPath for 2 days a week, in addition to running Refugee Education Australia. So we're essentially sister organisations. SkillPath has an international purview, so they're the INGO, and Refugee Education Australia is particularly interested in what happens for people who are already in Australia or for the students when they arrive. And part of our role is to do academic preparation. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, we didn't get any money from the government in the end. And we weren't asking for much. I think the ask was for about $1 million over 4 years. So in many ways, probably did us a massive favour because it's made us much more agile. We were able to move to working in the Asia Pacific, which wasn't part of the original plan. And we've been really able to kind of do things in a very AI forward. I think, in fact, Steph would describe SkillPath as an AI native company. We've developed a whole brilliant back-end database. So we've got a very tight process. We've done a lot of work on qualification comparability, and making sure that when we're looking at GPAs that they are pretty accurate to Australia's reading of people's admission, certificates for admission. We've got a whole program of admissions flexibility that we're working on to try and get universities to extend what they include for this cohort to things like the General Education Diploma, which is the highest qualification that you can really reasonably get in Thailand, for example, if you're displaced in Thailand. And we have a cast of quite significant and growing universities. Absolutely need to update the University of South Adelaide because they've now changed to become Adelaide University, and always seeking to grow that cohort and consortium of universities who really initially helped with co-design and now continue to help us to refine the programme and to sell the ambition of resettling new students. Here are our first 20 of this cohort. They've all arrived except for one. In the first selection, a couple of the students we initially selected chose not to pursue their offer for a couple of reasons. One was resettled with her family to Canada, and another had to withdraw for family reasons, but then was resettled with his family and reunited with his father in Italy. So that was a great outcome. I actually think these are 2 miracle stories, actually, because they're quite unusual for the global situation. Of these students, about 5 wanted to do nursing. Language was a bit of a barrier because language testing, and we've got a program to kind of look to remedy some of that will be announced soon. We've got a teacher, a teaching student in the mix, quite a few IT students, some engineers, a design student, a Bachelor of Arts student, and a couple of business students. So, and I think he went into biogenetics, one of the master's students at the University of Melbourne. I should know all of this details off by heart, but I don't. To come on board, we're asking universities to provide a soft landing. That includes at least 6 months free accommodation. That's the hard bit of the ask. But then about 2,200 startup stipend, ideally cash in a bank account that's ready to go when the student opens that bank account, and then access to study fee reimbursement up to 1,500. So not actually massively difficult, except for the accommodation ask, which is a bit more challenging. But we've got a scholarship with Scape, who are a purpose-built student accommodation provider, who've given us over 100,000 to help to kind of offset some of those costs. So if you know a university who might want to get involved, then let me know, or do an introduction for me. And we have recently interviewed our new cohort. We interviewed 75 students, and we have just this week, actually the end of last week, over the weekend, issued offers to those students. And so they'll be going to a legal clinic. This is not my part of the gig. It might be this week, but it will definitely be next week, so that they can start that process of being assessed and getting their humanitarian visa applications in. So hopefully, we're hopeful. We don't have an absolute figure that I can share with you, but we're absolutely hopeful that we will double the amount of students that we took this year, which means I need to get my pipe and start playing it a bit more, because I need more universities to come on board, and I need more universities to take more students. And ideally, we'll expand to TAFE as well, but that will require a slightly different soft landing. Thank you. That's it.
I'm going to be so polite and raise my hand, but I have a billion questions, but I'm going to limit it to one or two. I'd love to understand, and I know the university space is often so heavily influenced by the G08 and Sandstone University and that sort of influence. How are we placed to work with, I guess, mid-tier universities or education providers? What's the appetite like over there? Purely because I think from a financial inclusion perspective, sometimes it's a lot more accessible. And I guess the other sort of piggyback question is, I love that, we've got cash in the bank, we've got that accommodation, we've got the education, we've got the people. Where are we with state partner organisations to places like Study New South Wales, Study Adelaide, all of them, in sort of supporting something like this? And what's the sort of mental health, I guess, support we provide? And when I say mental health, I don't mean just the anxiety of being in a new place, but I think, I don't speak with lived experience, but I can acknowledge and understand that there is this duality that you're juggling, that you've got this displacement experience of leaving behind a life, and you're in a new community and a new society where social rules and unwritten rules really exist, and you don't know how to navigate that. But you have to navigate that. The university space is also interesting to navigate. Then you've got local politics that exist, local nuances. What's the sort of emotional support in that space? Do we have any feedback from, people we've resettled in that area?
Well, a lot of questions there, Ionica. So let me start with the first one, which is actually the Group of Eights have been, I think, unsurprisingly quickest to get involved. This time last year, we were selling a dream. Like, we think we've got this program, we've got, the allocation of 20 visas, come on board. It's going to be, we don't know what it's going to look like. Help us fly this plane as we build it at the same time. And so that was, I love it when there's an automatic light. Asma, you've been so wrapped that you haven't moved enough. So the mid-tier universities are just, they're, rural or regional universities in particular have been massively impacted by the proposed international student cuts, and are already less financially buoyant than the Group of Eights, which are generally the research intensive who get the most international students. So that has been a factor, no doubt. This is where equity recognition would really help, because if universities could see that refugees were a targeted equity cohort, then they could very easily use needs-based funding, which is the new equity budget, to support the students. Perhaps not with the accommodation, that remains a pretty high ask, but universities habitually give out quite high-level scholarships for example, equity cohorts. And so, the argument to the minister, and the argument remains, that without recognition, you are asking universities to apply a hearts and minds argument, and not many of them will, and not many of them do. Having said that, we were hopeful that the refugee student settlement pathway, because it connects in with international development and global engagement, and because it has this kind of on-campus opportunity to do volunteer leadership and to demonstrate, international development, it's an SDG 4 key example, and it's a brilliant example of being a welcoming university. So we were hopeful that universities would be able to see the value in terms of reputational currency and see it as a bit of a sexy program. I certainly think after having done it for a year with those brilliant pioneer universities who should get all of the kudos for being so pioneering, and some of them were not Group of 8. So UTS is not a Group of 8, Western Sydney's not a Group of 8, Deacon's not a Group of 8, Curtin's not a Group of 8. So, you know, but it's a mixed bag. With mental health, yes, absolutely. It's obviously something that we've been thinking about a lot and that we've built in. So, you know, there is a kind of need to direct students to on-campus counselling, but that's not sufficient for, you know, the kind of impacts of displacement and resettling. So we've also linked students in and we make referrals over to FAST providers when needed. So far, I think without sharing any confidential information, there's been, you know, obviously lots of homesickness, and a lot of students are wondering if they could return back to their displacement context to visit family. We did a lot of counselling in advance that this would mean leaving family. We did an orientation session, brought everyone together in Sydney at the beginning of the year and had RACs do a session on family reunion. That was quite distressing because the wait time for family reunification is really protracted and increasingly a challenging context, particularly for siblings and, you know, for immediate family members of partners and children. So that's important. The student welcome groups have been variably successful. You know, some of them are brilliant and have really done a massive wraparound, and big shout out to the University of Queensland because their student welcome group is really cracking. In other contexts, we just didn't have quite enough run-in time to get enough students involved. So they're more staff members, which isn't necessarily what this, you know, the student welcome group will eventually become more of a peer-to-peer model and very much sit in this kind of youth advocacy piece. And we'll have youth advocacy kind of opportunities within it as well. And I think, you know, we'll be looking to Mayan to provide support for leadership training and things in the later piece. But, you know, useful for providing social support. A lot of the students have done really well in their first assignments, but they've been working really, really hard and putting a lot of pressure on themselves. I think they're very aware that they're the first cohort. And so, you know, the success doesn't in any way rest on them. They're, you know, domestic students, they can go part-time, they can move university, they can change course, they can stop if they want to. We don't want them to, but they can. So, you know, it's not like they have to maintain a GPA and have reduced work hours like international students might need to. So they're not under those pressures. But these are important questions, Nyonika, and thanks for asking because, you know, we have thought about these things and we have consulted widely, and we did have the YAG really given us great. And the YAG was the Youth Advisory Group that Mayan facilitated for us, was comprised of a national cohort of students who've experienced forced migration and who are currently studying in higher ed or have recently graduated. So they were a wonderful source of guidance, obviously for RIA as well, but particularly for designing this, what it looks like on arrival. Does that answer all your questions?
It does.
Mostly?
I mean, it's definitely a work in progress, always, and the needs of the court obviously change. But I actually do love that, you know, we do have a non-GO8 appetite as well. It would be interesting to see how that gets switched around in the education context as well. There is a positive benefit and influx of having people with different lived experiences in your campuses as well. And I'd love to sort of move away from that business model take of, you know, we've got the money and we've got the research and we do this, but actually value people for people. So absolutely love your work.
Yeah. Well, you know, the Canadian program is funded through a levy on the SAF equivalent. And so it's not subject actually to, you know, the relative resources or available funding in each university. It really is about the way that they're able to do that, but which could be, you know, a pathway to future funding, but would need a big referendum campaign. And honestly, who's got the time and energy right now for that? That feels like a medium term piece. But you know, the accommodation cost lends itself easily to an advancement or philanthropic ask. For universities. So, you know, universities are pretty creative. They're excellent at offsetting their own costs by going to donors. What we have said, though, is really clearly, do not give up the people seeking asylum scholarships that you have fought for and that we have fought for and that have grown from 1 in 2016 to now 30 across the country. Don't give those up in exchange to take pathway students, because they're not the same. They're different cohorts, and for people seeking asylum, the opportunities are so limited that if you take those offers away. On that point, I'll just say that we are working with our new institutional member, Monash. Again, Asma, getting a big shout out. If you're a RIA member, then we will absolutely promote the flipping heck out of your scholarship. So Monash have got quite a few asylum seeker scholarships, humanitarian scholarships on offer for semester 2. So if you're in Victoria, or if you know any students who might want to move into state, a bit more of a heavy ask, then absolutely watch out for Monash's updates and RIA's updates on scholarship opportunities, because one of the worst things that can happen, ironically, is that universities put money into scholarships and then they're not realised. And then there's an argument to get rid of them. So, this is a collective piece, and definitely more, yes, thank you, Asma, definitely more, connecting between education and settlement and adjacent organisations and spaces is useful.
I just want to add one point, which is a key point about this scholarship, is that at the moment it's focusing on undergraduate scholarships. However, if you're considering to study medicine, Monash does have a direct pathway to medicine, but that is considered part of this scholarships. So keep that in mind, please.
That's great. Am I still sharing my screen? Sorry. I'm not. No. I was looking for the link to our scholarships table. So we do compile a list of scholarships. So if you do work with students who might be looking for a scholarship, then you can look at our website. We keep this regularly topped up. But we will be doing some cross collaborative promotion of this opportunity, and see if we can fill all of those scholarship places for Monash later this year and help people to realise their ambitions and help Monash to realise their ambition too. Not much time for chat. Sorry, Shannon.
No, that's fine. I was about to say we're just absolutely right on time. And as I said, we could probably talk about this for hours. Like, there's so much to unpack here from so many different angles. But again, just incredible work that's being done. It's just so lovely to hear. And I know there are some gaps that need to be addressed and a lot more work to do, but what's been accomplished is just really extraordinary. So thank you so much for coming along to give us a bit of an oversight about the report. I'd really encourage people to share it around and get in touch with Sally if maybe you want to have an offline chat, or maybe Sally, could come out and talk to some people in your own networks. We've got a lot of these resources uploaded onto the NPA resource library already, but I will send through the additional resources that Sally was talking about earlier. And Nayonika and I will actually have a think about how we maybe could drive a letter campaign. I think that would be really impactful. And I think, as a collective, I think we have, the potential for greater, a lot of impact from a national level. So we'll be reaching out for anyone who might be interested in that as well. And Sally, thank you.
Can I add something? I should have told everyone that we're actually convening, and they're being established at the moment, refugee education empowerment networks across all states and territories. Jow, I will be coming to talk to you about a Tasmanian REIN. And so that they're really school focused as a way of kind of pulling out some of the school-based opportunities, issues, practices that work really well, but in a state and territory based way to kind of convene a national network so that we can kind of also feed up to the states. I think that was your question, Nayonika, about the states and how they're involved. Not yet. I'd love to talk to you more about it. So watch out for the REIN network, Refugee Education and Empowerment Network, that's also developing. That's it. I promise, Shannon. I'm done.
Thank you, Sally. Sound good, Joyce. Lisa Sharon, who is the manager of ELD in Tassie, is online here anyway.
Excellent. Hi, Lisa. Let's have a chat.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to follow up. That's it. You're my final one. You're the last one in the set. So let's get Tassie on board. Let's get a new Tassie REIN.
Amazing. Thanks again, Sally. Thanks, Nayonika. And thank you, everyone, for taking time out of your day to come along and have these discussions. yeah, and we'll be in touch, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.